So let's look at question number 7. This is a number field with a validation rule that says it should allow values to be less than 100. A workflow is put in place to update the same number field to 200. What happens when the user enters the value 90? Let's create a new object. Let's go to Object Manager and create a new custom object called Scenario Tracker. We'll call it Scenario Tracker. We'll leave everything as is and we'll just say save. And inside this object, let's create a new custom field which would be of type number, and let's call it check value. So let's create a new field, and this should be a number field. And let's give it the name of check value. All right, so this can be of 18,0, and let's click on next. So I want this to be visible to my system admin, so I'll just provide the permissions for system admin. Next, I'll add it on the page layout and click on save. Right, now let's see our scenario tracker app. Okay, we'll also need to create a custom tab for it, right? Because it's a custom object. So let's quickly go to tabs and create a custom object tab. Let's click on new. We should get the option of selecting scenario tracker from the drop down here. Yep, so scenario tracker, I'll just select a dummy tab style and let's click on next. I'll keep it default on for all the profiles for now, and then I'll include the tab in all the applications for now. Let's click on save, and this should allow me to open the scenario tracker object. Let's refresh the page. And now let's search for scenario tracker. Yeah, this right here. So I misspelled it as without the n, that's why it was not coming. So that's okay. Now we have our object set up, and we have a custom field called check value. Now we'll look forward to setting up the validation rule and the workflow rule as per the scenario. But before that, let me quickly create a record and see if everything's working fine. So I can just give it a name of st01, and I can have any check value number and I can save it. Okay, I'm getting a storage limit exceeded error. Let me delete some records from the system. I think we imported some contacts, right? And that might have exceeded the limit. Since this is a developer edition org, you might have to clear some of it. So let's delete some of this records so that we get some space. Limit 4,000. Okay, I have it here. Let me just take the query, execute this. All right, so now I think we must have some data. There's just 24 records here on the contact. Sorry for this disruption, but now let's try to save the record here now in the scenario tracker object. I'll just name it st-01, check value was 230, click on save. So it's getting successfully saved, right? Now we need to introduce two things. One is the data validation rule and the other one is the workflow. So let's jump right into it. So I'll just open the setup from here. I'll go to Object Manager. I'll search for scenario tracker. And I need to add a validation rule, which will be available down below here, right? So let's go to validation rule. There should not be any for now, yeah, and let's create a new one. So the value should be less than 100 is what the scenario asks about, right? So let's create that validation rule. Should be less than 100, which means every time the check value, let's pick up the API name from here, is greater than or equal to 100, right? Every time this happens, the error should come up or throw up. So let's keep it on the top of the page and let's say check value should always be less than 100. Let's click on save. Yep, so it got saved, which means our error condition criteria is fine. Let's go back to our scenario tracker and let's click on edit. And now let's try to save it with some value which is greater than 100, right? Let's save it with 240 and let's see what happens. So you see, you are getting the validation error message saying check value should always be less than 100, which means our validation rule is set up now. What's the next thing that we need to set up? The workflow rule, right? So now let's move on to the workflow rule. I'll go to home and I'll go to workflow rules here. And just click on continue. And here we'll create a new rule, right? So I'll have to first select my object, and my object is scenario tracker. Should be somewhere right here, scenario tracker. Let's click on next. And I just want to say that update the check value field to 200. Right, that's what the scenario talks about. And I can keep any of these events for now. I'll just go with every time it's edited, and then I'll just check if there's any rule criteria. We do not have any rule criteria in the scenario, right? So I'll just say formula evaluates to true, and I'll evaluate this workflow every time. Okay, so I'll just click on save and next. And what are we supposed to do? We are supposed to do a field update that updates the check value field value to 200, right? So I'll just say update number field to 200, and I'll just select my field from here, which is check value, and I'll provide it a static number. I'll just say use a formula to set a new value, and I'll say 200. I'll click on save. Right, so now our workflow rule is set and we have added a field update here, and let's click on done, and we can activate this workflow. Right, okay, it's still not activated. Let me quickly click on it again. This might be an issue in the Lightning for the developer edition. Let me switch to Salesforce Classic. Yep, so let's go to this workflow rule here and let's activate it from Salesforce Classic. Yeah, so now it's activated. Now let's go ahead and try to create a new record. So let's go to scenario trackers and create a new record. Let's give it a name as T-02 and give it a check value of 105. The negative scenario. Let's click on save. So it's saying that the check value should always be less than 100. So we have to give a number value which is less than 100. Let's go with 90 and try to save it. So the record has been saved, but what you see is that the check value has been updated to 200, right? Which means your custom validation rules fire first and then the workflow rule executes. And after the workflow rule is executed, the custom validation rules are not fired again, right? So you are getting the check value as 200 even though the validation rule said that it should always be less than 100, right? So in terms of the order of execution, the custom validation rule comes first and then the workflow rule execution, which is why you are able to update the value to 200 and bypass the custom validation rule. So the answer to this question would be that the value would be updated to 200. All right, great. So question number 8, how do you create a master detail field for an object which is a child if it already has some records? Alright, so the next question talks about how do we create a master detail relationship field for an object that already has some records, right? So let's take the same example, scenario trackers, to check whether how is it possible or what needs to be done. So let's go to setup and let's go to object manager, right? Let me switch to Lightning for this purpose. And let's go to setup. So I'll go to object manager, scenario trackers, under fields and relationships, I'll try to create a new field. or basically a relationship, which would be a master detail, right? So here let's see if I get the option to select. Yes, I do have an option to select a master detail relationship. Let's click on next. Related to, let's relate it to account object. All right, let's click on next. So account would be the parent object. You can just name it account. This would be called scenario trackers, and I'll leave all the settings as is, and I'll click on next. And this will be visible for all the profiles, because this becomes a required field being a master detail relationship, and this will be available on the page layout as well. So let's click on next, and let's click on save. So you see, you get a prompt which says that you cannot create a master detail relationship, and it says that you cannot create a relationship on an existing objects if records already exist. So the solution that they are providing is, you must first create a lookup relationship, populate the lookup field with data, and then convert that relationship type to master detail. So the answer to this question is that we cannot directly create a master detail relationship, because when we create a master detail relationship, the lookup or the relationship field becomes a mandatory field, right? And if you already have some records in the system, they might not have that parent field attached to it, right? That's why Salesforce says that first create a lookup relationship, populate all the lookup relationship values in the existing fields, and then you can very well convert your relationship into a master detail one. All right, so let's try to do that, and if see that's successful. So what, instead of going for a master detail, we'll go for a lookup relationship, right? Let's click on lookup relationship and click on next. I'll associate it with account, all the same settings once again. Just click on next, and this time you see that the visible option is optional. You can either check or uncheck, because this is not a master detail relationship. I'll just keep it in the layout and click on next. I'll keep it on only on the account layout, which is something that I'm using as the system admin right now, and I'll click on save. All right, now let's go to our scenario tracker records, whichever that we created recently. Let's go back to them. Let's go to the all list here, and let's open these two records. Let me quickly refresh the screen just to get that lookup relationship field on the page layout. Yeah, so the account field is coming up here, right? So let me select any account from this list. I'll just create a new one. I don't think there are accounts in the system here, so I'll just call it SF training, and I'll just save it. I'll click on save. So this says that the check value, okay, so our validation rule is working fine. Let me just use this as 30. This got updated to 200, which means our previous solution is still working as is, which is good. Let's go back to scenario trackers and update the second record as well. All right, so we have two records in the system, and we have linked a parent field, which is the lookup relationship, for both the records. And now let's, okay, the same issue again. And now let's try to convert this relationship into master detail relationship. All right, now let's go back and let's go into the account field. And how do we convert a relationship field into a different one? We can just click on this edit button here, and you get an option called change field type. You see this right here? Using this change field type, you can move from a lookup to a master detail relationship. All right, let's click on next, and we will keep everything as is, and we can just directly click on the save button. Now you see that your relationship has been converted to a master detail relationship now from a lookup. And for scenarios wherein you already have some records, this is how you proceed, in terms of converting a relationship from a lookup to a master detail, and then actually using it for your object. All right, so far so good. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 9. How can you navigate to a particular URL in Lightning? Next question is, how do we navigate to a URL in Lightning, right? So for Lightning, let's create a custom component and call it navigate to URL component. Let's click on new, and let's create a Lightning component, and I'll call it navigate to URL comp, right? And let's say submit. So our basic Aura bundle will be ready, and in the component, let's first of all create a div. So the use cases will create a button on click of which will actually be redirected to some link, maybe google.com, right? So let's try to do that. So inside the div, what I'll do is I'll create a button, I'll use the SLDS libraries and I'll declare an on-click event for this button, right? What would be my on-click event? This would be handle navigation, right? Let's click on save. And I'd want this to be aligned, so let's look at it first. So how do I preview my component? So just to preview my component from the developer console, what I'll have to do is I'll have to create a Lightning application, right? So let's create a Lightning application and I'll call it navigate to URL app, right? And I'll just say submit. Right, so our application is created and you see this preview button coming up here. This allows us to preview our components. All we have to do is embed our Lightning component within this application. And how do I do it? I'll just use the C annotation and I'll just say navigate to URL comp, which is the name of my component. Right, let's save the application and click on the preview button. This should open up a new tab containing our component. Let's see how things look like. Okay, it's a blank screen, but yeah, I see a button right here, right? So there's a button right here, but I don't see anything written on it. So let's try to add some text and improve the styling of it. So I'll go back to my component and I'll just say navigate. So this is the first thing I'll be doing. I'll add a text to it. Let's refresh our view and the name should be coming up on the button now. So you see, I see a button called navigate, but there's no styling and it's right on the corner of the application window, right? So let's try to add some styling to it. So first of all, I'd want this to be aligned absolutely center, right? So I'll just use the SLDS library class, which says absolute center, and this should align it to the center. Okay, let's go back and preview this. So you see it's still here, which means we are missing out something, and that is having the force SLDS class extended to the application. So we have to use a command saying extends force SLDS on our application level, and only then the SLDS library will come into effect. And if you see, and if I just refresh this now, you see that the button has already come in the center and it is a good blue colored button because we've used an SLDS button library as well, right? If I want to just give it a bit of decoration, let's just add one more class in here. I'll click on save. Let's see. Yep, so I get a good green color button and the hover vibes are good, right? And I would want to have some space around my button, so just for decorations and cosmetic purposes, I'll just add a margin tag also. So I'll just create a margin tag. And let's save this, and now let's preview this. Yep, so you see I'm able to click my button and it looks pretty much okay, right? Nothing fancy, nothing great, but now let's click on the button and I get an error saying unable to find action. This is because we have not defined the action as of now, right? When I say action, I mean this on-click event, right? So let's define this on the controller library, controller file. So I'll just create the controller by clicking on the controller tab here, and I'll just name my action handle navigation. Let's click on save, and just to check whether our function is working fine, I'll just create an alert. I reached here, right? Let's click on save, and now let's refresh our component. And now that I click on this button, you see I get an alert, which means our function on click is working fine. And now the only thing left is to navigate to google.com, right? So how do I do it? There's something that Salesforce provides to navigate into different URLs, and that's an event which is called the navigate to URL event, right? So I'll just declare a URL event parameter or a variable in JavaScript, just like a normal variable, and I'll use the $a library, right? And then I'll call my event, which is e.force.navigate to URL, right? This is my event, and I would want to fire this event basically to navigate to URL. So I'll just use the fire method, but I also need to declare one more thing, which is the end URL, right? The endpoint URL, and that URL will be added as a key value pair. So for all events, you add values as parameters using the set params method, and you put it in the key value pair format. All right, so I'll just create a key value pair format here. My key would be URL always, and then here will be my actual endpoint URL. So let me just give the entire address of google.com, and I think this should work fine. But before that, the set params method needs to be associated to the URL event variable, right? Because this is what the event is about. So we declared the event, we fired the event, and in between we just set the parameters that the URL should point to this particular link right here. All right, now let's give it a try and see what happens. I'll just add the semicolon here. Let's click on save. Let's go back, refresh this page, and now let's click on the navigate button. So it says I reached here, which is fine. Okay, we are still getting an error which says URL event.set params is undefined, is not on the object. So let's see what did we do wrong. All right, so I'll just remove the alert because it is a bit distracting now. And where URL event $a.get e.force. Okay, so e.force colon navigate to URL is something that we want to type, because this is the library and this is the event that it holds. So it won't be dot here, it would be a colon, right? Now let's try to refresh this, and I'm hoping it should work this time. Let's click on the navigate button. It's still giving me an error saying URL event.set params has an issue. So let's see what's the issue there. So URL, and this is the value that I've associated with it, and this is the, I think this looks fine. Okay, I see what's going on here. Since we are using the preview button using the lightning application option here, it's not able to sort out the dependency, right? So let me do something. Let me keep the code as is, just to be super sure and certify that this should work fine if you are using it in real time. What we'll do is we'll create a custom tab for our component. All right, so to create the custom tab, all we need to do is we need to define that this component is app hostable, right? So for this we implement a interface which is called force colon app hostable. All right, let's save it, and now that we save it, let's go to setup and let's go to tabs, and let's create a lightning component tab, right? So we have already created a custom object tab. Let's create a lightning component tab. Let's click on new, and since we added that interface, our component should come here in the drop down, and it is coming, right? So navigate to URL component. I'll just say navigate to Google would be the name of my tab label. I'll just provide it a tab style, and I'll just click on next. I'll keep it on for all the profiles for now. Yeah, so lightning component tab is visible now. So let's refresh our screen right here, and let's navigate to the navigate URL component or the tab. So let's go to the app launcher, let's type navigate, and let's click on this item right here, right? Let's click it, and now let's click on the navigate button. So you see I've been redirected successfully to google.com, right? Which means because of the lightning out dependency, you cannot use the $a library or the $a localization instance in your controller, and even if you use it, it might not work, because this will always return undefined. All right, because this library is not available when you are using it through lightning applications. That's kind of a security concern for Salesforce, which is why it's not available here. But the same code works fine if you embed it in your Salesforce ecosystem, right? Just like we saw. All right, let's move on to the next question. Question number 10. When would you use database.query and database.query locator? So database.query can be used in normal Apex classes and triggers wherein the governor limit for maximum number of rows retrieved for each Apex transaction is 50,000. Well, on the other hand, database.query locator is used for batch or bulk jobs and provides flexibility to work with more than 50,000 records, up to 50 million. So the query locator method is used in batch jobs. Question 11. How would you set up time-triggered actions in Salesforce? Question talks about time-triggered actions. Now, what are time-triggered actions? Time-triggered actions are nothing but If you want to do some activity later or probably at some point in time based on a parameter, let's say 3 days from now, 24 hours later, 48 hours later, 2 weeks later, you want to send out an email notification, you want to check if the status is this, you want to send an email to the case rep that you need to work on this probably after 2 weeks when the due date is past 2 weeks. So these kind of time triggered scenarios or time dependent scenarios can be handled in two ways in Salesforce, and those two ways are using process automation. The first one being workflow rules. So let's go to workflow rules. I'll just quickly show you where it is. We won't be actually working on a actual scenario, and if you see that each workflow rule consists of a time dependent action, right? So let's click on continue and let me show you how to reach there or get there. So I'll just create a new rule here and I'll just associate this with any random object for now. Let's click on next, and if you see there are three events available. Either it's created, when it's created and every time it's edited, and when it's created and anytime it's edited to subsequently meet criteria. Now out of these three, if you just click on this, you see that you cannot add time triggered dependent workflow actions with this option. All right, so you just have the option to add it when it's either created or anytime it's edited to subsequently meet criteria, and this suffices most of our requirements, right? So let me just select the third option and let me just click on the formula evaluates to true and just set it as true for now because we don't have any criteria per se. Let's click on save and next. Oh shoot, I need to provide an rule name, right? So I'll just say dummy rule name 1 and I'll just click on next now. Right, so if you see, we have the normal immediate workflow actions, right? And alongside that we have some time dependent workflow actions. So immediate actions would be, creating a new task, email alert, field update, or an outbound message, right? But apart from that, we can also add some time triggers. Now once I click on the add time trigger, you see that it gives me an option to set time based scenarios. So I can say 15 days from now, right? So 15 days or 15 hours. I have two options, either hours or days. So the limitation of time triggers is you don't have minutes and seconds available, you just have days and hours, right? And you can have both before and after, right? So you have both kinds of scenarios available. So I'll just choose after, and then you have all the time fields for your current object, for the current workflow object, right? Since you are operating on the account object, you have these four fields available. So let's say a scenario is every time an account record is created, 15 days later, send an email to the manager or the owner of the account that you need to look into it or close it, something of that sort. It could be a good use case for an opportunity. So 15 days after account created date is what I would select, and I'll click on save. Right, so this initiates a time triggered scenario, and once I have a time triggered scenario, I can again add some actions inside it. So I could send out an email alert to my manager or the account owner, right? And that would execute only after 15 days of the account creation. And that's how you'd probably set up a time triggered scenario in workflow rule. What's the other option? You can move from workflow rules to process builders, right? So I'll just move to process builders from here. Alright, so let me create a new process builder, a dummy one for now, and let's call it account process. And I'll just select whenever the record is changed, I want this process builder to be initiated. Let's click on save. Now in process builder, it is a bit tricky, but like you see here, you already see something called immediate actions, and then you see scheduled actions, right? So scheduled actions are the one wherein you can set something based on the time, right? Time lapse. So I'll just add an object here just to showcase how it works. Let's select the account object, and you see we have two options, only when a record is created and when a record is created or edited, right? Now in this case, if we go with the first option and click on save, the scheduled actions will be available for us to be set, right? But if I go and select the second option here and let's click on save, you see that the scheduled actions went away. Just like workflow rules, we did not have the option to set time triggered scenarios in the event when the record is created or edited, right? But there's a catch here. On the criteria, if you have selected the second option, which is when a record is created or edited, and you click on save, your criteria node will define whether you can get some time triggered action or not. So I'll just say, is this criteria met? And I'll just add my criteria for now. Let's keep it formula evaluates to true, or just say no criteria, just evaluate the actions. I'll actually have to keep either the conditions are met or formula evaluates to true. And then down below you see there's this advanced option coming up here, right? Let me click here and you see it says, do you want to execute the actions only when the specified changes are made to the record? And when I select yes and click on save, you see I can set some scheduled actions here. So for the first use case, only when a record is created, you have the liberty to set scheduled actions. But in case when a record is created or edited, the only time you can set scheduled actions is when your formula evaluates to true. Basically, based on a certain condition, only then you want to evaluate something based on the time frame. And if you keep this checkbox checked, you will probably get the schedule actions box coming up here. If you keep it unchecked and click on save, you see the box will not be available here to set time triggered actions. Alright, so these are the two ways, automated ways, point and click configurations, workflow rules and process builders through which you can configure time triggered scenarios. Alright, let's move on to the next question. Question number 12. Can you write a code to automatically add opportunity team members every time an opportunity is created? So the team member should be the opportunity owner and the owner's manager. Alright, so this question talks about creating some default opportunity team members every time an opportunity is created, right? So opportunity team members are children of the opportunity object, which is the parent, right? And the question talks about adding the opportunities owner and the opportunity owner's manager as the default two team members. All right, so we'll have to write a trigger code for it, and let's look into it. Let's close all these other tabs, and now let's create a new trigger on opportunity. So I'll just call it opportunity trigger, and I'll select the opportunity object from the drop down. Right. And now what should be my event? It should be after insert, right? So every time the opportunity is inserted, I want to write a code to take care of the opportunity team member creation. Now, what's the best practice to, segregate code? It's trigger and trigger handler, right? So let's write a trigger handler and add a method here. So before moving on, let me just create an Apex class, which is actually my Apex trigger handler or the opportunity trigger handler. Let's click on OK. And I would want to create a method down here that would be activities after insert, right? All my activities that need to be performed after the insert operation will be done here, and I would be passing my trigger.new variable, which is my opportunity records, which would be a list of opportunity, right? Let me just save this first. All right, so this is saved, but it's throwing an error saying, okay, there's the error on the opportunity trigger. That's okay, we can update it. So I'll just call out the method from here, activities after insert, and I'll just pass the trigger.new variable, right? Control S. So this should save up fine. Let's see. Okay, we are still seeing some error down here. Let me just check the problem. Method does not exist. Activities after insert from the type opportunity trigger handler. I think I'll have to save this first. Yep, now the error has gone. It was some save issue. And before moving on, I'll also want to add a check saying if trigger dot is after and trigger dot is insert, right? So that this explicitly runs only for the after insert events, or else this would run for all the other events too, which is something that we don't want for now, right? So let's save it. So now our trigger is ready, and let's move on to the handler for writing the entire logic, right? So this file is saved successfully. Let's move on to our trigger handler. So what do we need to do? Let's frame it in English. So every time an opportunity is created, create two team members. One would be the opportunity owner and the other guy would be the opportunity owner's manager, right? Let's sort this logic. So first of all, I'd want to create opportunity team member records. Agreed? These are the records I'd be wanting to create. So what I can simply write is I can create an instance for opportunity team member. I'll call it op member 1. And here the associated user should be the opportunities owner. So I can take the owner ID, right? And what should be the parent for this opportunity member? That should be the parent opportunity. So I'll just take the parent ID and use the op ID, and I'll add this op member to a list for to be inserted later, right? So I'll just add it, right? This is my first opportunity team member, and I have declared a list. So let me define this list here, and this would be a list of opportunity team member type, right? So let me just define the list. Let's click on save. Right, I'm getting errors almost everywhere, which is fine for now. That's okay. Let's, because we don't have the op assigned as of now, we don't have uh, what is owner ID for op, because op is still not familiar, right? We are just trying to figure out our way from the bottom up approach. What would be my second team member? The second team member would be my owner's manager, right? So I'll just create one more here, op member 2. I'll just replace all the instances of 1 with 2 here, and I'll add it. Let's click on save. Now here the parent ID still stays the same, but the user ID would be my opportunity owners manager. I'm writing it in English for now, but we'll change it later. All right, so this guy should be the opportunity owners manager. I'll just comment it so that it does not throw an error. Let's save it. Right, so now that you see, the first and foremost issue is coming up on this line, and it says that there's an invalid type opportunity team member, which means my developer console is unable to figure out what is opportunity team member. But this is an object that exists. However, since we are using a free developer edition org, which does not have all the configurations enabled, there's one configuration which is called team selling or opportunity team selling. If you see opportunity team settings, we have to enable team selling, and only when you enable team selling, opportunity teams are enabled in your system. And since this is not enabled as of now, we are not able to access it. Salesforce has not provided the opportunity, or the accessibility to access this object. Let me just enable this for now. Let's click on save, and I'll just put it on the opportunity layout. Should be fine. And now that the team settings or the team selling is enabled, let me try to save this now, and let's see if the errors reduce for me. I still see the errors. Let me click on save again. Okay, the errors are still popping up. That's okay. Let's look at it. Or should I just refresh the screen? Let me quickly refresh this page. Maybe a refresh is needed. Let's close the contact triggers. Let's open opportunity trigger and the trigger handler. Okay, our code is gone. That's okay. I'll write it again. So first of all, we'll set up a list. Let's click on save and see if this line is giving an error. So it's saving without an error now, right? That means it's enabled now. And what are the two things that we want to install? The two opportunity team members. Member 1 and member 2. Right? Similarly, I'll just add member 2 as well. Click on save. All right, now what are the two fields that I want to add in here? One is the user ID and the other one is the parent ID. These are the two mandatory fields that you need to assign for your opportunity team member. So I'll just assign parent ID. This would be my op ID and this would be my opportunities owner ID. Agreed? All right, Let me just save it, comment it for now, because we don't have access to this opportunity. We'll be taking it from the list of opportunity that comes in here. And for the same, in the same way, the second one should be pointing to the parent ID, same parent ID, but the user should be owner's manager, somewhat of this sorts, right? Let me just save it like this for now. Cool. Now our opportunity teams are sorted, but we'll need a good chunk of things before we move on there, right? So how would I do this? I'll iterate my code on the number of opportunities that have come in, first of all, and which opportunities have come in. These are the op records, right, that I received in this method through trigger.new. So this code should run for all those opportunities, and then outside here I'll just insert op team members. When would I insert it? If op team members is not empty. I'll just add a not in starting. So this will only execute if this op team members has some value inside it. Let me save it. Right, so as of now our code is error free and everything looks good based on our understanding. Now there are some certain things that I need to fetch. Now my first team member can be sorted, because now that I have looped in my opportunity records, I can create one team member just by using my opportunity record here, op. This should say without error again. Okay, we are getting an ID. Now let's see what is that ID. It says variable does not exist, parent ID. Okay, I think it should be opportunity ID maybe. Let me check. Should be opportunity ID. Let's try with opportunity ID. I think that is what, yeah, that's the field, opportunity ID basically. All right. And now for the second one, I think I can associate my opportunity ID, but how do I get my owner's manager, right? So for this, I need to do a socle, and I need to query what is the manager record. So I can write a socle like select ID comma manager ID from user. Now, which user should I query? So I should be able to query users which are part of this opportunity, right? Whose owners are opportunity owners. So how do I figure that out? So first of all, we need to query all our user IDs from these opportunities. So I can just run a query saying for each opportunity in op records, let's populate the user ID list. And what users do I want? I just want all the owners of my opportunity, right? Now since we don't have this user ID list, let me just create a list here. Right, let's click on save. So now a user list is ready, and I can use this list to query all my users. Now I'll get a filtered set of users wherein the users and their manager's ID will be in my list. So where ID in user list, right? Let's click on save. Now I want to create a map. And why do I need it? Because here down below we are iterating on multiple opportunity records, right? So here I should be able to check for which opportunity and for which opportunity's owner I want to fetch the manager ID, right? So let's formulate a map which would be of type, ID comma ID, wherein the key would be, the key value pairs would be the owner ID or the opportunity ID versus the owner ID, right? This is the first map that we'll want to create, and the second map that we would want to create is the key value pairs. The first one would be the opportunity ID, and the second one would be the manager ID, right? Let's try to sort these two maps out. So how can I create my first map? I can very well create it on my first iteration here, right here, right? I'll just call it opportunity versus user map dot put op.id comma op.owner ID, right? So my map will be ready here. And let me just define two maps here so that we don't run into errors. right? This is my first map. I'll tell you why it's needed and how it's needed. We'll see just in a minute. So we have populated a user list which we use to query all our user records along with their managers, and only focused user records which are part of this opportunity records. And then we created a map which has a key of opportunity ID pointing to the opportunity owner ID. Right, now let's create another map which is opportunity versus manager map. Right, this is our second map that we are creating. All right, and now we need to iterate over, first of all, our opportunity records and also our user records. Let me just align it, Control S. Now how do I figure out the manager for each user? I can simply use if op versus user map does this make sense? So I'm just checking my map. If the value for the current opportunity ID, the user, is equal to user record ID, the current user in the second iteration, I can populate my map saying op versus manager map dot put the current opportunities ID and the current manager's ID. So how do I get my manager ID? By using the user record dot manager ID. Right, so this will populate my map for each opportunity containing different user records, but only the focus record wherein the criteria matches in this line 8, line 19 with the if condition. Right, so if there are three opportunities and they have three user records or three owners, basically this user records is nothing but the list of all the owners, right, all the owner IDs. So for the first iteration it will check if the op versus user map, which is something that we populated here with the opportunity ID comma owner ID, if this matches the record from this list, in that case populate the user records manager ID as the value for the key of opportunity ID. Right, so using this first map we are able to populate the second map. That's why we needed our first map, op versus user map, just to check this here in this condition. So now we have our op versus manager map ready, and it will be very simple to just uncomment this line. And how do I fetch my user ID now? I can use this map, op versus manager map dot get. I have my opportunity ID right in the iteration right here, so I can just say dot get op dot id, and this should populate my manager. Let's click on save. And yes, so our entire code has been saved without any errors, and it's time to test our code. Right, so let's do something. Let's go to setup first of all. I'll just close this tab. Let's go to opportunities, and I'll just define a manager for my record. So let's go to users. So now every time a record of opportunity is created, the owner ID and the owner's manager, these two people should automatically be added as opportunity teams. So if we just let's set up that configuration first. So let's go to SF trainer record and let's edit, and let's go right down below to the manager section. This is where I can add a manager, right? So let me just add the some other user here. So I'll just search for integration user. I think that guy should also be present. Yeah, so let me just select the integration user for now and click on save. So now SF trainer, which is my record, will be the owner, and the manager would be the integration user. Now let's check if these two guys get added to the opportunity team every time a record is created. So I'll create a new opportunity record. I'll call it team setting op. I'll add a close date, and I think that should do it. Let's click on save. Okay, it's saying the stage is a mandatory field. Let's select the stage, click on save. Okay, there's some error coming up saying that there's a required field missing, right? So required fields are missing. Opportunity ID, line 40 for our code. So let's go back to our code and see what's missing here. This is line 40 and it's saying that opportunity ID is missing, but I think we already added it, right, in both these cases. Okay, I see what's missing. See, we named it op2, but here it's still op1. So let's rename it to op2 and now let's save it. That's why this was missing. These two required fields were missing for the second record. Now let's go ahead and click on the save button. This should work fine. So the opportunity has been created. Let's see how the teams are looking. So where do we see the teams? Let's see if it's here down below in the related section. Yeah. So you see two people have been added here, the SF trainer and the integration user, which means our code is working perfectly fine. All right. Let's do a quick recap of what we did just to understand. I know this might be a bit overwhelming, but it's pretty straightforward. Let's look into it. We created a trigger wherein we added a method to handle all our activities after insert, and we put it inside the after insert events. We passed our trigger.new record, new variable, which stores all the list of opportunities that have been created. It comes to this method, and first of all what we do is we do a for loop and we populate all our user IDs. And when I say user IDs, these are nothing but the owners of the opportunities. And then we also create a map in the same iteration where the key is the opportunity ID and the owner ID is the value. And then we do a socle query on the user records to fetch the manager ID, right? Because there's no other way to get the manager ID from the user record. So it is a filtered query wherein only those records which have come in as opportunity owners in this list will be filtered, and only those manager IDs will be available in this user record list. Next, we wrote a for loop again, and there's a nested for loop iterating on the list of user records, and we are using our map that we just framed to check if the current opportunity user maps owner ID matches the iteration user records ID. In that case, we populate another map saying the key should be the opportunity ID. And then once we have our opportunity manager map ready, that's all we need. So we just wrote another iteration and we created two team members. The first team member got created without any hassle or without any issues because the owner ID and op ID are both available on the op records. And the next one, the only thing that we had to figure out was how to associate the opportunity owners manager, and for that we created a map, and using the get operator we pointed out to the op.id, and the value that we'll receive is the manager ID that's pointing to the user ID, and we tested it with one record, and when every time we create an opportunity, these two guys are being added. This is the opportunity owner and this is the opportunity owners manager. All right, cool. Let's look at the next question.